Father Florovsky's Limits of the Church. It is very difficult to give an exact and firm definition of a sect or schism. I distinguish the theological definition from the simple canonical description, since a sect in the Church is always something contradictory and unnatural, a paradox and an enigma. For the Church is unity, and the whole of her being is in this unity and union of Christ and in Christ, for in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body. 1 Corinthians 12:13. And the prototype of this unity is the consubstantial Trinity. The measure of this unity is Catholicity or communality, where the impenetrability or personal consciousness is softened and even removed, in complete unity of thought and soul. And the multitude of them that believe are of one heart and soul. Acts chapter 4 verse 32. A sect, on the other hand, is separation, solitariness, the loss and denial of communality. The sectarian spirit is the direct opposite of the church spirit. The question of the nature and meaning of divisions and sects in the church was put in all of its sharpness as early as the ancient baptismal disputes of the 3rd century. At that time, St. Cyprian of Carthage developed with fearless consistency a doctrine of the complete absence of grace in every sect, precisely as a sect. The whole meaning and the whole logical stress of his reasoning lay in the conviction that the sacraments are established in the Church. That is to say, they are effected and can be effected only in the Church, in communion and in communality. Therefore, every violation of communality and unity in itself leads immediately beyond the last barrier into some decisive, quote, outside, end quote. To St. Cyprian, every schism was a departure out of the Church, out of that sanctified and holy land where alone there rises the baptismal spring, the waters of salvation. The teaching of St. Cyprian as to the gracelessness of sects is only the opposite side of his teaching about unity and communality. This is not the place or the moment to recollect and relate Cyprian's deductions and proofs. Each of us remembers and knows them, is bound to know them, and is bound to remember them. They have not lost their force to this day. The historical influence of Cyprian was continuous and powerful. Strictly speaking, in its theological premises, the teaching of St. Cyprian has never been disproved. Even Augustine was not very far from Cyprian. He argued with the Donatists, not with Cyprian himself, and did not try to refute Cyprian. Indeed, his argument was more about practical measures and conclusions. In his reasoning about the unity of the Church, about the unity of love as a necessary and decisive condition for the saving power of the sacraments, Augustine really only repeats Cyprian in new words. But the practical conclusions drawn by Cyprian have not been accepted and supported by the consciousness of the Church. One may ask how this was possible if his premises have been neither disputed nor set aside. There is no need to enter into the details of the Church's canonical relations with sectarians and heretics. It is an imprecise and an involved enough story. It is sufficient to state that there are occasions when, by her very actions, the Church gives one to understand that the sacraments of sectarians, and even of heretics, are valid, that the sacraments can be celebrated outside the strict canonical limits of the Church. The Church customarily received adherents from sects, and even from heresies, not by the way of baptism, thereby obviously meaning or supposing that they have already been actually baptized in their sects and heresies. In many cases, the Church receives adherents even without chrism, and sometimes also clergy in their existing orders. All the more must this be understood and explained as recognizing the validity of reality of the corresponding rites performed over them outside the Church. If sacraments are performed, however, it can only be by virtue of the Holy Spirit, and canonical rules thus establish or reveal a certain mystical paradox. In what she does, the Church bears witness to the extension of her mystical territory, even beyond her canonical borders. The quote, outside world, quote, does not begin immediately. St. Cyprian was right. The sacraments are accomplished only in the Church, but he defined this, quote, in, quote, hastily and too narrowly. Must we not rather argue in the opposite direction? Where the sacraments are accomplished, there is the Church. St. Cyprian started from the silent supposition that the canonical and charismatic limits of the Church invariably coincide, and that it is his unproven equation that has not been confirmed by the communal consciousness of the Church. As a mystical organism, as the sacramental body of Christ, the Church cannot be adequately described in canonical terms or categories alone. It is impossible to state or to discern the true limits of the Church simply by canonical signs or marks. Very often the canonical boundary determines the charismatic boundary as well, and what is bound on earth is bound by an indissoluble bond in heaven. But not always, and still more often, not immediately. In her sacramental, mysterious being, the Church surpasses all canonical norms. For that reason, a canonical cleavage does not immediately signify mystical impoverishment and desolation. All that Cyprian said about the unity of the Church and the sacraments can be and must be accepted, but it is not necessary to draw with him the final boundary around the body of the Church by means of canonical points alone. This raises a general question and a doubt. Are these canonical rules and acts subject to theological generalization? Is it possible to ascribe to them theological or dogmatic grounds and motivation? Or do they rather represent only pastoral discretion and forbearance? Ought we not to understand the canonical mode of action as a forbearing silence concerning gracelessness, rather than as a recognition of the reality or validity of schismatic rites? And if so, is it then quite prudent to cite or introduce canonical facts into a theological argument? This objection is connected with a theory of what is called economy or economia. In general ecclesiastical usage, economy is a term of very many meanings. In its broadest sense, it embraces and signifies the whole work of salvation. The Vulgate usually translates it by dispensatio. In canonical language, economy has not become a technical term. It is rather a descriptive word, a kind of general characteristic. Economy is opposed to strictness or acrivia, as a kind of relaxation of church discipline, an exemption or exception from the strict rule, or from the general rule. The governing motive of economy is precisely philanthropy, pastoral discretion, a pedagogical calculation. The deduction is always from practical utility. Economy is an aspect of pedagogical rather than canonical consciousness. Economy can and should be employed by each individual pastor in his parish, still more by a bishop or council of bishops, for economy is pastorship and pastorship is economy. In this the whole strength and vitality of the economic principle and also its limitations. Not every question can be asked and answered in terms of economy. One must ask, therefore, whether it is possible to treat the question of baptism of sectarians and heretics as a question only of economy. Certainly, insofar as it is a question of winning lost souls for Catholic truth, of bringing them to the word of truth, then every course of action must be economic, that is, pastoral, compassionate, and loving. The pastor must leave the 99 and seek the lost sheep. But for this very reason, the need is all greater for complete sincerity and directness. Not only is unequivocal accuracy, strictness, and clarity, in fact, acrivia, required in the sphere of dogma. How otherwise can unity of mind be obtained? But accuracy and clarity are above all necessary also in mystical diagnosis. Precisely for this reason, the question of the rites of sectarians and heretics must be asked and answered in terms of the strictest acrivia. To the strict rule, he means. For here it is not so much a quasatio iris as a quasatio facti, it's Latin, and indeed of mystical fact. Sacramental reality is not a matter of recognition, so much as a diagnosis. It is necessary to identify and to discern mystical realities. Least of all is the application of economy to such a question compatible with the radical standpoint of St. Cyprian. If beyond the canonical limits of the Church, the wilderness without grace begins immediately, if schismatics have not been baptized and still abide in the darkness that precedes baptism, then perfect clarity, strictness, and firmness are even more indispensable in the acts and the judgments of the Church. Here no forbearance is appropriate or even possible, no concessions are permissible. Is it in fact conceivable that the Church should receive sectarians or heretics into her own body, not by way of baptism, simply in order thereby to make their decisive step easy? This would certainly be very a rash and dangerous complaisance. Instead, it would be connivance with human weakness, self-love, and a lack of faith. A connivance all the more dangerous in that it creates the appearance of a recognition by the Church that schismatic sacraments and rites are valid, not only in the minds of schismatics or people from outside, but in the consciousness of the majority of people in the Church and even of its leaders. Moreover, this mode of action is applied because it creates this appearance if in fact the Church were fully convinced that in sects and heresies baptism is not accomplished. To what end would she reunite schismatics without baptism? Surely not in order to save them by this step from a false shame in the open confession that they have not been baptized. Can such a motive be considered honourable, convincing, and of good repute? Can it benefit the newcomers to reunite them through ambiguity and suppression of truth? To the reasonable question whether it would not be possible, by analogy, to unite Jews and Muslims to the Church by economy, and without baptism, Metropolitan Anthony Krapovitsky, the founder of Rokor, replied with complete candour, but all such neophytes, and even those baptized in the name of Montanus and Priscilla, would not themselves claim to enter the Church without immersion and the utterance of the words in the name of the Father, etc. Such a claim could only be advanced through a confused understanding of the Church's grace by those sectarians and schismatics whose baptism, worship, and hierarchical system differ little externally from those of the Church. It would be very insulting to them on their turning to the Church to have to sit on the same seat with heathens and Jews. For that reason, the Church, indulging their weakness, has not performed over them the external act of baptism, but has given them this grace in the second sacrament. From the Metropolitan Anthony's argument, common sense would draw precisely the opposite conclusion. In order to lead weak and unreasoning neophytes to the clear understanding of the Church's grace which they lack, it would be all the more necessary and appropriate to perform over them the external act of baptism, instead of giving them and many others by a feigned accommodation to their susceptibilities. Not only an excuse, but a ground to continue deceiving themselves through the unequivocal fact that their, quote, baptism, worship, and hierarchical system differ in little externally from those of the Church, quote. One may ask who gave the Church this right not merely to change, but simply to abolish the external act of baptism, performing it in such cases only mentally, by implication or by intention at the celebration of the second sacrament, i.e. chrismation, over the unbaptized. Admittedly, in special and exceptional cases, the external act, or the form, quote, may indeed be abolished. Such is the martyr's baptism in blood, or even the so-called baptisma flaminis. But this is admissible only in necessity. Moreover, there can hardly be any analogy between these cases and systemic connivance and another sensitive and self-deception. If, quote, economy, quote, is pastoral discretion, conducive to the advantage and the salvation of human souls, then in such a case one would speak of the economy in reverse. It would be a deliberate retrogression into an equivocation and obscurity for the sake of purely external success. Since the internal enchurchment of neophytes cannot take place in such concealment, it is scarcely possible to impute to the Church such a perverse and crafty intention. And in any case, the practical result of this economy must be considered utterly unexpected. For in the Church herself, the conviction has arisen among the majority that the sacraments are performed even among schismatics, that even in the sects there is a valid, although forbidden, hierarchy. The true intention of the Church in her acts and rules would appear to be too difficult to discern, and from this point of view as well as the economic explanation of these rules cannot be regarded as convincing. The economic explanation raises even greater difficulties when we consider its general theological premises. One can scarcely ascribe to the Church the power and the right, as it were, to convert the has not been into the has been, to change the meaningless into the valid, as Professor Diavonitis expresses it in Church Quarterly Review, number 231, April 1931, page 97, in the order of economy, this would give a particular sharpness to the question whether it is possible to receive schismatic clergy in their existing orders. In the Russian Church, adherents from Roman Catholicism or from the Nestorians, etc., are received into communion through recantation of heresy. That is through the sacrament of repentance. Clergy are given absolution by a bishop, and thereby the inhibition lying on a schismatic cleric is removed. One asks whether it is conceivable that in this delivery and absolution from sin there is also accomplished silently and even secretly baptism, confirmation, ordination as a deacon or priest, sometimes even consecration as bishop, without any form or clear and distinctive external act which might enable us to notice and consider precisely what the sacraments are being performed. Here there is a double equivocation, both from the standpoint of motive and from the standpoint of the fact itself. Can one, in short, celebrate a sacrament by virtue of intention alone, and without some visible act? Of course not, not because there belongs to the form some self-sufficient or magic effect, but precisely because in the celebration of a sacrament, the external act and the pouring forth of grace are in substance indivisible and inseparable. Certainly, the Church is the steward of grace, and to her is given the power to preserve and teach these gifts of grace. But the power of the Church does not extend to the very foundations of Christians' existence. It is impossible to conceive that the Church might have the right, in order of economy, to admit to the priestly function without ordination to the clergy of schismatic confessions, even of those that have not preserved the apostolic succession, while remedying not all defects but a complete lack of grace, while granting power and recognition by means of unexpressed intention. In such an interpretation, the whole sacramental system becomes too soft and elastic. Alexei Komyakov, too, was not sufficiently careful when in defending the new Greek practice of receiving reunited Latins through baptism. He wrote to Palmer that, quote, all sacraments are completed only in the bosom of the true Church, and it matters not whether they be completed in one form or another. Reconciliation with the Church renovates the sacraments or completes them, giving a full and orthodox meaning to the rite that was before either insufficient or heterodox, and the repetition of the preceding sacraments is virtually contained in the rite or fact of reconciliation. Therefore, the visible repetition of baptism or confirmation through though unnecessary, cannot be considered as erroneous, and establishes only a ritual difference without any difference of opinion, and that's quoted from Alexei Komyakov in Russia and the English Church, page 62. This is impossible. The repetition of a sacrament is not only superfluous and impermissible. If there was no sacrament, and what was previously performed was an imperfect heretical rite, then the sacrament must be accomplished for the first time, and without complete sincerity and candour, in any case, the Catholic sacraments are not just rites, and it is not possible to treat the external aspect of a sacramental celebration with such disciplinary relativism. The economic interpretation of the canons might be probable and convincing, but only in the presence of direct and perfectly clear proofs, whereas it is generally supported by indirect data and most often by indirect intentions and conclusions. The economic interpretation is not the teaching of the Church. It is only a private theological opinion, very late and very controversial, which arose in a period of theological confusion and decadence, in a hasty endeavour to dissociate oneself as sharply as possible from Roman Catholic theology. Roman Catholic theology admits and acknowledges that there remains in sects a valid hierarchy, and even in a certain sense the apostolic succession, so that under certain conditions sacraments may be accomplished, and actually are accomplished, among schismatics and even among heretics. The basic premises of this sacramental theology have already been established with a sufficient definition by St. Augustine, and the Orthodox theologian has every reason to take the theology of Augustine into account in his own doctrinal synthesis. Florovsky there says that Catholics believe a very similar position that he has, and this is before Vatican II, by the way, because this was wrote in 1933, I think, and so just thought that was interesting. The first thing to notice in Augustine is the organic way in which he relates the question of the validity of sacraments to the doctrine of the Church. The reality of the sacraments celebrated by schismatics signifies for Augustine the continuation of their links with the Church. He directly affirms that in the sacraments of sectarians, the Church is active. Some she engenders of herself, others she engenders outside herself. Of her maidservant, and schismatic baptism is valid for this very reason, that it is performed by the Church. And that's in On Baptism, he says that. What is valid in the sects is that which is in them from the Church, that which remains with them as their portion of the sacred inner core of the Church, that through which they are with the Church. The unity of the Church is based on a twofold bond, the unity of spirit and the bond of peace. In sects and schism, the bond of peace is broken and torn, but the unity of the spirit in the sacraments is not brought to an end. This is the unique paradox of sectarian existence. The sect remains united with the Church in the grace of the sacraments, and this becomes a condemnation once love and communal mutuality have withered and died. With this is connected St. Augustine's basic distinction, the distinction between the validity or reality of the sacraments and their efficacy. The sacraments of schismatics are valid, that is, they genuinely are sacraments, not forms per se, but they are not efficacious by virtue of schism and division, for in sects and schism love withers, and without love salvation is impossible. There are two sides to salvation, the objective action of God's grace and man's subjective effort or fidelity. The Holy and Sanctifying Spirit still breathes in the sects, but in the stubbornness and powerlessness of schism, healing is not accomplished. It is untrue to say that in schismatic rites nothing is accomplished, for if they are considered to be only empty acts and words deprived of grace, by the same token not only are they empty, but they are converted into a profanation or a sinister counterfeit. If the rites of schismatics are not sacraments, then they are blasphemous caricature, and in that case neither economic suppression of the facts nor economic glossing over sin is possible. He means that in the pastoral sense. The sacramental rite cannot be only a rite, empty but innocent. The sacrament is accomplished in reality. Nevertheless, it is impossible, Augustine argues, to say that in the sects the sacraments are of avail or efficacious. The sacraments are not magic acts. Indeed, the Eucharist itself may also be taken unto judgment and condemnation, but this does not refute the reality or validity of the Eucharist. The same may be said of baptism. Baptismal grace must be renewed in unceasing effort and service, otherwise it becomes inefficacious. From this point of view, St. Gregory of Nyssa attacked with great energy the practice of postponing baptism to the hour of death, like with Constantine the Great, for at least 2 advanced years. In order to avoid pollution of the baptismal robe, he transfers the emphasis. Baptism is not just the end of sinful existence, rather is the beginning of everything. Baptismal grace is not just the remission of sins, but a gift or pledge. His name may be entered in the army list, but the honour of a soldier lies in his service, not in his calling alone. What does baptism mean without spiritual deeds? Augustine wishes to say the same thing in his distinction between character and grace. In any case, there rests on everyone baptized a sign or seal, even if he falls away into parts, and each will be tried concerning to this sign or pledge in the day of judgment. The baptized are distinguished from the unbaptized, even when baptismal grace has not flowered in their works and deeds. Even when they have corrupted and wasted their whole life, that is the ineffecable consequence of their divine touch. This clear distinction between the two inseparable factors of sacramental existence, divine grace and human love, is characteristic of the whole sacramental theology of St. Augustine. The sacraments are accomplished by grace and not by love, yet man is saved in freedom and not in compulsion. For that reason, grace somehow does not burn with a life-giving flame outside communality and love. One thing remains obscure. How does the activity of the Spirit beyond the canonical borders of the Church? How does the activity of the Spirit continue beyond the canonical borders of the Church? What is the validity of sacraments without communion? Sacraments of stolen garments, sacraments in the hands of usurpers, Recent Roman Catholic theology answers that question by the doctrine of the validity of the sacraments as ex opere operato. In St. Augustine, this distinction does not exist, but he understood the validity of sacraments performed outside the canonical unity in the same sense. In fact, ex opere operato points to the independence of the sacrament from the personal action of the minister. The Church performs the sacrament, and in her Christ the High Priest. The sacraments are performed by the prayer and activity of the Church. Ex opere orantis et operantis ecclesia, it is in the sense that the doctrine of validity ex opere operato must be accepted. For Augustine, it was not so important that the sacraments of the schismatics are unlawful or illicit. Much more important is the fact that schism is a dissipation of love, but the love of God can overcome the failure of love that is present in man, in the sects themselves and even among the heretics. The Church continues to perform her saving and sanctifying work. It may not follow, perhaps, that we should say that schismatics are still in the Church. In any case, this would not be precise and sounds equivocal. It would be truer to say that the Church continues to work in the schisms, and in expectation of that mysterious hour when the stubborn heart will be melted in the warmth of God's prevenient grace, when the will and thirst for communality and the unity will finally burst into flame. The quote validity quote of sacraments among schismatics is the mysterious guarantee of their return to Catholic plenitude and unity. The sacramental theology of St. Augustine was not received by the Eastern Church in antiquity, nor by Byzantine theology, but not because they saw in it something alien or superfluous. Augustine was simply not very well known in the East. In modern times, the doctrine of the sacraments has not been infrequently been expounded in the Orthodox East and in Russia on a Roman model. But there has not yet been a creative appropriation of Augustine's conception. Contemporary Orthodox theology must express and explain the traditional canonical practice of the Church in relation to heretics and schismatics, on the basis of those general premises which have been established by Augustine. It is necessary to hold firmly in mind that in asserting the validity of sacraments and of the hierarchy itself in the sects, St. Augustine in no way relaxed or removed the boundary dividing sect and communality. This is not so much a canonical as a spiritual boundary. Communal love in the Church, and separatism and alienation in the schism. For Augustine, this was the boundary of salvation. Since grace operates outside communality, but does not save, it is appropriate to note here too that Augustine closely follows Cyprian, who asserted that except in the Church even martyrdom for Christ does not avail. For this reason, despite all the quote reality quote and quote validity quote of his schismatic hierarchy, it is impossible to speak in a strict sense of the retention of the apostolic succession beyond the limits of canonical communality. This question has been investigated exhaustively and with great insight in the remarkable article by the late C.G. Turner, which is called The Apostolic Succession, in Essays on the Early History of the Church and in the Ministry, edited by H.B. Sweet, 1918. From this, it follows without a doubt that the so-called branch theory is unacceptable. The branch theory is a common idea that is usually held in Anglican groups, and it's the heresy of ecumenism. This theory depicts the cleavages of the Christian world in too complacent and comfortable a manner. The onlooker may not be able to immediately discern the schismatic branches from the Catholic trunk. In its essence, moreover, a schism is not just a branch, it is also the will for schism. It is the mysterious and even enigmatic sphere beyond the canonical limits of the Church where the sacraments are still celebrated, and where the hearts often still burn in faith, in love, and in works. We must admit this, but we must remember that the limit is real, that the unity does not exist. Alexei Komyakov, it seems, was speaking of this when he said, "Inasmuch as the earthly invisible Church is not the fullness and completeness of the whole Church which the Lord has appointed to appear at the final judgment of all creation, she acts and knows only within her own limits, and according to the words of Paul the Apostle to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 5 verse 12, does not judge the rest of mankind and only looks upon those as excluded, that is to say, not belonging to her, who have excluded themselves. The rest of mankind, whether alien from the Church or united to her by ties which God has not willed to reveal to her, she leaves to the judgment of the great day. And that's in Russia and the English Church again, page 194, quoted by Alexei Komnikov, I think. In the same sense, Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow decided to speak of the church with churches which were not purely true. This is what he says. Mark you, I do not presume to call false any church which believes that Jesus is the Christ. The Christian church can only either be purely true, confessing the true and saving divine teaching without false admixtures and pernicious opinions of men, or not purely true, mixing with the true and saving teaching of faith in Christ the false and pernicious opinions of men. Conversations between a seeker and a believer concerning the orthodoxy of the Eastern Greco-Russian Church of Moscow, 1831, pages 27 to 29. You expect now that I should give judgment concerning the other half of present Christianity. The Metropolitan said in the concluding conversation, but I simply just look upon them in part how I see the head and the Lord of the Church heals the many deep wounds of the old serpent in all parts and limbs of his body, applying now gentle, now strong remedies, even fire and iron, in order to soften hardness, to draw out poison, to clean wounds, to separate out malignant growths, to restore spirit and life in the numbed and half-dead members. In this way I attest my faith that in the end the power of God will triumph openly over human weakness, good over evil, unity over division, life over death. These statements of Metropolitan Philaret are a beginning only. Not everything in them is clearly and fully expressed, but this question is truly put. There are many bonds still not broken, whereby schisms are held together in a certain unity with the Church. The whole of our attention and our will must be concentrated in directing towards removing the stubbornness of dissension. We seek not conquest, says St. Gregory of Nazianzen, or often called St. Gregory the Theologian, but the return of our brethren whose separation from us is tearing us apart.